Welcome back, everybody. Today we will be reading chapter 17. So let's get into it. I'm going to raise this up a little bit. Alright. Chapter 17. The Neitherlands. Quentin was swimming. Or he could have been swimming, but in fact, he was just floating. It was dark, and his body was weightless, suspended in chilly water. His testicles shrank in on themselves away from the cold. Wavering, heartless sunbeams lanced down through the darkness. After the first shock, the coolness of the water, combined with the weightlessness, felt indescribably good to his dried-out, feverish, unshowered, hungover body. He could have thrashed and panicked, but instead he just let himself hang there, arms out in a dead man's float. Whatever was coming next would come. He opened his eyes, and the water bathed them in moist, healing chill. He closed them again. There was nothing to see. It was a glorious relief. The numbness of it was just magnificent. At the moment when it had been at its most intolerably painful, the world, normally so unreliable and insensitive in these matters, had done him the favor of vanishing completely. Granted, he would need air at some point. He would look into that in due course. As bad as things were, drowning would still be a hasty course of action. For now, all he wanted was to stay here forever, hanging neutrally buoyant in the amnoidic void, neither in the world nor out of it, neither dead nor alive. But an iron manacle was clamped around his waist. It was Alice's hand, and it was pulling him upward ruthlessly. She wouldn't let him be. Reluctantly, he joined her in kicking toward the surface. Their heads broke water at the same moment. They were in the center of a still, hushed, empty city square, treading water in the round pool of a fountain. It was absolutely silent. No wind, no birds, no insects. Broad paving stones stretched away in all directions, clean and bare, as if they'd just been swept. On all four sides of the square stood a row of stone buildings. They gave off an impression of indescribable age. They weren't decrepit, but they'd been lived in. They looked vaguely Italianate. Ooh, that is a word. They could have been in Rome or Venice, but they weren't. The sky was low and overcast, and a light rain was falling, almost mist. The droplets dimpled the still surface of the water, which made its way into the pool from the overflowing bowl of a giant bronze lotus flower. The square had the air of a place that had been hastily abandoned. 5 minutes ago or 5 centuries, it was impossible to tell. Quentin treaded water for a minute, then took one long brushstroke over to the stone lip. The pool was only about 15 feet across, and the rim was scarred and pocketed. Old limestone. Bracing himself with both hands, he heaved himself up and flopped out of the water onto dry land. Jesus, he whispered, panting. Fucking Penny. It is real. It wasn't just because he hated Penny. He really hadn't thought it was true. But now, here they were in the city. This was it. The actual Neitherlands, or something that looked uncannily like them. It was unbelievable. The most naive, most blissfully happy, sappy dream of his childhood was true. God, he'd been so wrong about everything. He took a deep breath, then another. It was like white light flooding through him. He didn't know he could be this happy. Everything that was weighing him down, Janet, Alice, Penny, everything, was suddenly insubstantial by comparison. If the city was real, then Fillory could be real too. Last night had been a disaster, an apocalypse, but this was so much more important. It was almost funny now. There was so much joy ahead of them. He turned to Alice. This is exactly... Her fist caught him smack in his left eye. She hit like a girl, without any weight behind it, but he hadn't seen it coming to roll with it. The left half of the world flashed white. He bent over, half blind, the heel of his hand over his eye. She kicked him in the shins, one and then the other, with dismaying accuracy. "Asshole! You asshole!" Alice's face was pale. Her teeth were chattering. "You bastard! You fucking coward!" "Alice," he managed. "Alice, I'm sorry, but listen, look." He tried to point at the world around them while also verifying that his cornea was still intact. "Don't you fucking speak to me." She slapped wildly at his head and shoulders with both hands so that he ducked and put up his arms. "Don't you even dare talk to me, you whore, you fucking whore." He staggered a few steps away across the stone, trying to escape, his sopping wet clothes flapping, but she followed him like a swarm of bees. Their voices sounded small and empty in the echoless square. "Alice! Alice!" His orbital ridge was a ring of fire. "Forget about that for a second. Just for a second." She'd still been holding the button in her fist when she clocked him. It must be a lot heavier than it looked. "You don't understand. It was just everything." There was a right way to say this. "I got confused. Life just seemed so empty. I mean, out there." "It's like what you said. We have to live while we can. Or that's what I thought. But it got out of control. It just got out of control." Why was he talking in cliches? Get to the point. He definitely had one. "We were all just so drunk." "Really? Too drunk to fuck?" She had him there. "I could kill you. Do you understand that?" Her face was terrible. There were 2 white-hot points on her flushed cheeks. "I could burn you to nothing right where you stand. I'm stronger than you. Nothing you could do would stop me." "Listen, Alice." He had to stop her from talking. "I know it's bad. It's very, very bad, and I'm so sorry. You'll never know how sorry. You have to believe me, but it's so important that you understand." "What are you, a child? You got confused? Why didn't you just end it, Quentin? You obviously lost interest a long time ago. You really are a child, aren't you? You're obviously not enough of a man to have a real relationship. You're not even enough of a man to end a real relationship. Do I have to do absolutely everything for you? Or do you know what it is? You hate yourself so much. You'll hurt anybody who loves you. That's it, isn't it? Just to get even with them for loving you. I never saw that before now." She stopped at this, shaking her head, lost in a dream of disbelief. Her own words had brought her up short. In the silence, the fact that he had cheated on her, and with Janet of all people, hit her all over again, as fully as it had the first time, 2 hours ago. Quentin could see it. It was like she'd been shot in the stomach. She held up her hand, palm out, like she was shielding her eyes from his monstrous face. A lock of wet hair was plastered to her cheek. She was gasping for breath. Her lips had gone pale, but they kept moving. "Was it worth it?" she said. "You always wanted her. You think I didn't see that? You think I'm stupid? Answer me. Do you think I'm stupid? Just tell me. I really want to know if you think I'm stupid." She ran at him and slapped his face. He took the full force of the blow. "No, I don't think you're stupid, Alice." Quentin felt like a boxer who was knocked out standing, out on his feet, crosses for eyes, just wishing to God that he could fall down. She was right, 1,000 times right. But if he could just make her see what he saw, if she could only put things in proper perspective. Fucking woman. She was walking away now toward one of the alleys that led to another square, leaving a trail of damp, squashing footprints behind her. But will you please look around you?" he was begging, trailing after her, his voice ragged with exhaustion. "Will you please acknowledge for a second That's something more important than who stuck what body part where is going on around you. She wasn't listening, or maybe she was just determined to say what she was going to say. You know, she said, almost conversely, crossing into the next square. I bet you actually thought fucking her was going to make you happy. You just go from one thing to the next, don't you? And you think it's going to make you happy. Breakbills didn't. I didn't. Do you really think Janet would? It's just another fantasy, Quentin. She stopped and hugged her arms over her midsection, like the pain was a gastric ulcer, and sobbed bitterly. Her wet clothes clung to her. A little pool was forming around her. He wanted to comfort her, but he didn't dare touch her. The stillness of the square was almost tangible around them. The Fillory books had described them as all exactly identical, but he could see they weren't, far from it. They shared the same crypto-Italian style, but this one had a colonnade on one side, and the fountain in the center was rectangular, not round like the one they'd come in through. At one end, a white marble face vomited water into it. Footsteps on stone. Quentin thought he would have welcomed any interruption, anything, especially if it was carnivorous and would eat him alive. Kind of a reunion, isn't it? Penny came stepping briskly across the flagstones towards them. The gray facade of a stone pizza loomed above them, with heraldic inlays, an anchor, and 3 flames. Penny looked as happy and relaxed as Quentin had ever seen him. He was in his element and glowing with pride. His clothes were dry. Sorry, I've spent so much time here, but I've never had anybody to show it to. And wouldn't think that would matter, but it does. When I first came through, there was a corpse lying right there on the ground, right over there. He pointed like a campus tour guide. Human, or close to it anyway. Maybe Maori? He had a tattoo on his face. He could only have been dead a few days, but he must have gotten trapped here. Came in, but the pools wouldn't let him out somehow. I think he died of starvation. The next time I came, the body was gone. Penny studied their 2 faces and took in the situation for the first time. Alice's tears, Quentin's rapidly darkening black eye, their toxic body language. Oh. His face softened slightly. He made a gesture, and suddenly their clothes were warm and dry and pressed, too. Look, you have to forget about all that stuff here. This place can be dangerous if you're not paying attention. I'll give you an example. Which way would you go to get back to our home square? Alice and Quentin looked around obediently. Penny's reluctant students. In their running fight, they had cut an angle through the second square into a third, or a fourth. Their footprints had already faded. There was an alley on each side of the square, and through each alley, you could catch a glimpse of other irregular alleys and fountains and squares, more and more, diminishing to infinity. It was like a trick with mirrors. The sun was hidden, if there even was a sun. Penny was right. They had no idea which one led back to Earth, or even which general direction they'd come from. Don't worry, I marked it. You only came about a quarter mile, one up and one over. Penny pointed in exactly the opposite direction Quentin would have guessed. In the book, they just wander at random, and it always comes out all right, but we have to be more careful. I use orange spray paint to mark a path. I have to do it fresh every time I come here. The paint disappears. Penny headed back in the direction he'd pointed, tentatively, without looking at each other. Quentin and Alice fell in behind him. Their clothes were getting damp all over again from the rain. I have strict operating procedures when I'm here. There are no directions, so I've had to invent new ones. I name them after the buildings in the Earth Square, one for each side. Palace, villa, tower, church. Can't be a real church, but that's what it looks like. This is Churchward. the way we're going now. They were back at the fountain, which Penny had circled with big sloppy X's of fluorescent orange paint. A little way off there was a crude shelter, a tarp with a cot and a table underneath. Quentin wondered how he'd missed it before. I set up a base camp here for a while with food and water and books. He was so excited, like a rich, unpopular kid the first time he brings home friends to see his fancy toys. He didn't even notice that Quentin and Alice weren't saying anything. I always thought it would be Melanie who came here the first time, but she could never quite work the spells. I tried to teach her, but she's not quite strong enough. Almost, though. In a way, I'm happy it's you guys. You know you were the only friends I ever had at Breakbills. Penny shook his head as if there was something amazing about the fact that more people didn't like him only 12 hours ago, Quentin thought. That more people didn't like him. Only 12 hours ago, Quentin thought, he and Alice would have barely been able to keep from cracking up with conspiratorial laughter at the suggestion that they had even been friends with Penny. Oh, I almost forgot. No light spells here. They go crazy. When I first came here, I tried to do a basic illumination. I couldn't see for 2 hours afterward. It's like the air here is hyperoxygenated, only with magic. One spark and everything goes up. There were 2 stone steps leading up to the fountain. Quentin sat down on the top one and leaned his back against the rim. The water looked unnaturally black, like ink. There was no point in fighting anymore. He would just sit here and listen to Penny talk. You wouldn't believe how far I've walked in this place. Hundreds of miles. Way farther than the Chatwins ever went. Once I saw a fountain that had overflowed like a plugged-up toilet and flooded its square a foot deep, and a foot deep and a half the squares around it. Twice I've seen ones that were capped, sealed over with a bronze cover like a well, like they were keeping people out or in. Once I found fragments of white marble on the pavement. I think it was a broken sculpture. I tried to piece it back together to see what it was a statue of, but I never could. You can't get into the buildings. I've tried every way you can think of. Lockpicks, sledgehammers. Once I brought in an acetylene cutting torch, and the windows were too dark to see in. But once I brought a flashlight, one of those high-intensity rescue flashlights that the Coast Guards use. When I turned it all the way up, I could see inside just a little bit. I'll tell you something, they're full of books. Whatever they look like on the outside, on the inside, every one of these buildings is really a library. Quentin had no idea how long they'd been there, but it was a while. Hours, maybe. They'd walked through square after square like lost tourists, the 3 of them. Everything they saw shared a common style and the same weathered ancient look, but nothing ever quite repeated. Quentin and Alice couldn't look at each other, but they couldn't resist the seductions of this grand, melancholy place either. At least the rain had let up. They passed through a tiny square, a quarter the size of the others and paved in cobblestones, where if they stood in the center, it seemed like they could hear the ocean, the breaking and withdrawing of waves. In another square, Penny pointed out a window with ghostly scorch marks above it, as if it had been the scene of a fire. Quentin wondered who had built this place, and where they'd gone. What happened here? Penny described in great technical detail his elaborate but ultimately unsuccessful campaign to rappel up the side of one of the buildings to get a view above the rooftops. The one time he'd managed to secure a line on a piece of decorative masonry, he'd been overcome by dizziness halfway up, and when he recovered he found himself turned around, rappelling down the same wall he'd been trying to ascend. At different times, all 3 of them saw, in the farthest possible distance, a verdant square that seemed to contain a garden, with rows of what might have been lime trees in it. but they could never reach it. As they approached, it always lost itself in the shifting perspectives of the alleyways, which were slightly out of alignment with one another. "We should get back," Alice said finally. Her voice sounded dead. It was the first time she'd spoken since she screamed at him. "Why?" Penny asked. He was having the time of his life. He must have been terribly lonely here, Quentin thought. "It doesn't matter how much time we spend here, you know. No time passes on Earth. To the others, it'll be like we popped out and popped right back, just like that. Bing bang. They won't even have time to be surprised. I spent a whole semester here once and nobody noticed." "I'm sure we wouldn't have noticed anyway," Quentin said, because he knew Penny would ignore him. "I'm actually probably a year or so older than you guys subjectively, because of all the time I've spent here. I should have kept closer track." "Penny, what are we doing here?" Penny looked puzzled. "Isn't it obvious, Quentin? We're going to Fillory. We have to. This is going to change everything." Okay. Something nagged at him about this, and he was going to put it into words. He had to force his weary brain to grind out thoughts. "Penny, we have to slow down. Look at the big picture. The Chatwins got to go to Fillory because they were chosen. By Ember and Umber, the magic sheep. Rams. They were there to do good, to fight the Watcher Woman, or whatever." Alice was nodding. "They only got to go when something was going on," she said. "The Watcher Woman, or the Wandering Dune, or that ticking watch thing in the Flying Forest, or to find Martin. That was what Helen Chatwin was saying. We can't just go barging in without an invitation. That's why she hid the buttons in the first place. They were a mistake. Fillory wasn't like the real world. It was a perfect universe where everything was organized for good. Ember and Umber are supposed to control the borders. But with the buttons, anybody could get in. Random people who weren't a part of the story. Bad people. The buttons weren't part of the logic of Fillory. They were a hole in the border, a loophole." The mere fact that Alice knew her Fillory lore, cold, no hesitation, added another high-powered exponent to Quentin's guilty, bankrupt longing for her. How could he have gotten so confused that he thought he wanted Janet instead of her? Penny was nodding and rocking his whole body forward and backward simultaneously. "But you're forgetting something, Alice. We're not bad people." The zeal light came on behind Penny's eyes. "We're the good guys. Has it occurred to you that maybe that's why we found the buttons in the first place? Maybe this is it. We're getting the call. Maybe Fillory needs us." He waited expectantly for a reaction. "It's thin, Penny," Quentin said finally, weakly. "This is all really thin." "So what?" Penny stood up. "So what? So what if Fillory doesn't work out? Which it will. So we end up somewhere else. It's another world, Quentin. It's a million other worlds. The Neitherlands are the place where all worlds meet. Who knows what other imaginary universes might turn out to be real? All of human literature could just be a user's guide to the multiverse. Once I marked off 100 squares straight in one direction and never saw the edge of this place. We could explore for the rest of our lives and never begin to map it all. This is it, Quentin. It's the new frontier, the challenge of our generation and the next 50 generations after that. It all starts here, Quentin, with us. You just have to want it. What do you say?" He actually stuck out his hand, as if he expected Quentin and Alice to put theirs on top of his. Then they would all do a football cheer. Go team. Quentin was sorely tempted to leave him hanging, but finally he let Penny give him a limp low five. His eye still throbbed. "We should get back," Alice said again. She looked exhausted. She couldn't have slept much last night. Alice produced the oddly weighty pearl button from her pocket. It looked ridiculous, It had sounded reasonable enough in the books, but that was the books, and the Chatwins had used the buttons only the one time. In real life, it was like they were playing some children's game. It was a little kid's idea of a magical object, though what did you expect from a bunch of talking bunnies? Back in their home square, they lined up on the edge of the fountain, holding hands, balancing precariously on the rim. The prospect of getting wet again was unspeakably depressing. In a corner of the square, Quentin saw that a sapling had broken its way up through one of the paving stones from below. It was gnarled and bent, twisted almost into the shape of a helix, but it was alive. It made him wonder what had been paved over to build the city, and what would be there if it should ever fall. Had there been woods here? Would there be again? This too shall pass. Alice stood on Penny's other side so she wouldn't have to touch Quentin. They stepped off the edge together, right foot first, in sync. The crossing was different this time. They fell down through the water like it was air, then through darkness. Then it was like they were falling out of the sky, down toward Manhattan on a gray Friday morning in winter. Brown parks, gray buildings, yellow taxis waiting on stripy white crosswalks, black rivers studded with tugboats and barges. Down through the gray roof and into the living room where Janet and Elliot and Richard were still caught in mid-double take, as if Alice had just now grabbed the button in Penny's pocket, as if the past 3 hours hadn't even happened. "Alice!" Janet said gleefully. "Get your hand out of Penny's pants!" And that's it for today. We'll see you guys next week with Chapter 18.